If I asked you why God created the universe, you would probably give a standard Sunday school answer, you know?
Right. You might say it was for his glory. Or maybe out of love.
Yeah, or to share his goodness.
Mhm.
But what if I told you that to truly answer that question, to actually comprehend the mechanics of why the Creator spoke reality into existence, you first have to understand why you chose to sit in rush hour traffic this morning.
It sounds a bit wild. I mean, connecting those two
It
things.
really does. But welcome to Reformed Thinking. We are doing a deep dive today into the anatomy of motivation.
Yes, and we are going to examine a classic, incredibly dense theological text today. It is Jonathan Edwards' a dissertation concerning the end for which God created the world.
Right, and specifically, we are focusing on his introduction. That is where he sets up his terms and his general positions.
And, well, if you are listening to this and wondering why you should care about an 18th century theologian's definitions of goals and ends, stick with us.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Because understanding the precise reasons why any agent acts, and specifically the precise reasons why God acts, shapes our entire view of reality. It shapes our view of providence and your actual place in the universe.
Spot on. If you can understand the mechanics behind a decision, you can understand the final goal of the cosmos.
It is a phenomenal text. And Edwards brings this remarkable clarity to the subject.
He really does. He approaches theology with a rigorous, almost mathematical logic.
So the goal today is not simply to read a historical document, right? We want to parse the precise anatomy of motivation and desire.
Yes, we are going to break down how a mind works when it wants something. We start with human minds, and then we move to the divine mind.
Because Edwards establishes a whole system here. He builds a vocabulary of motivation.
Right. He recognizes that before we can even begin to discuss why God created the universe, we have to agree on what a reason or a goal actually is.
Well, it's so crucial because we use words like goal and aim and end very loosely in our everyday language.
We do, but Edwards refuses to be loose. He categorizes every type of desire so that when we finally look at the Creator, we are using the correct tools to comprehend his actions.
So let us start at the very bottom, right at the base of his argument.
Sounds good. He begins with a ground-level distinction.
Yeah, he separates all goals into two massive categories. We have subordinate ends and ultimate ends.
Let us tackle the subordinate end first.
Okay, so a subordinate end is something an agent aims at, but not at all upon its own account.
Right. It is sought wholly as a means to a further goal.
And Edwards gives a brilliant, simple example for this. He asks you to imagine a man going on a trip to obtain a medicine to cure an illness.
Getting that medicine is his subordinate end.
Why? Because he does not value the medicine for its own sake?
No, the medicine itself might be bitter or expensive or just hard to find.
Yeah, if you separate the medicine from the further goal, which is his health, he does not desire that medicine at all.
It has zero intrinsic value to him. It is purely a stepping stone.
And that leads directly to the counterpart, right? The ultimate end.
Yes, an ultimate end is that which the agent seeks for its own sake.
It is what he loves, what he values, and what he takes pleasure in on its own account, not only as a means to a further goal.
Edwards uses the example of eating fruit here.
Right, a man loves the taste of a particular sort of fruit.
So he will go to great pains and cost to obtain it purely for the pleasure of the taste.
Well, he values that pleasure on its own account. He loves the pleasure, and he's not eating the fruit simply for the sake of some other good.
The taste is the final stop.
What is so fascinating here is how Edwards separates actions from intrinsic value.
I mean, we do many things in life that we do not actually like.
All the time. We endure them simply to get to a point where we experience something we do value for its own sake.
We subject ourselves to discomfort, labor, expense, all as subordinate means.
Right, just to finally arrive at an ultimate end where our desire terminates and rests.
That concept of desire terminating and resting is key.
It really is. Edwards points out that these stepping stones can form a massive chain.
He outlines a literal chain of ends to show how far this goes.
Let us walk through that. So, a man sells a garment to get money.
And he uses the money to buy tools.
Right. He uses the tools to till his land.
He tills the land to obtain a crop.
He gets the crop to supply himself with food.
And he makes the food to gratify his appetite.
That gratification of the appetite is the ultimate end.
Every single step before it was subordinate.
It is so much like looking at modern life. I mean, think about your average Tuesday.
Oh yeah, you sit in miserable bumper-to-bumper traffic on the highway.
That is a subordinate end.
Yeah.
You do not love traffic for its own sake.
Definitely not. You sit in traffic to arrive at a gray office building.
And you go to the office to work on a tedious, mind-numbing spreadsheet.
You work on the spreadsheet to get a paycheck.
Right. You use the paycheck to buy groceries.
And you buy the groceries so you can host a backyard barbecue with your friends on Saturday afternoon.
Sitting in traffic and working on spreadsheets have no intrinsic value to you.
If you remove the barbecue and the fellowship from the equation, you would never choose the traffic.
The barbecue is the ultimate end where your desire rests.
And if we look at how that operates in real time, you can see how Edwards is building a framework for all human behavior.
Yeah, he notes that an end can actually be both subordinate and ultimate at the same time.
He gives the example of seeking a person's love and respect.
You might seek their friendship partly on its own account, right? Because it is pleasant to be loved by someone.
In that sense, it is an ultimate end.
But you might also seek their friendship because you hope they will assist you in your business affairs later on.
And in that sense, it is a subordinate end, a stepping stone to financial gain.
This shows the intricate nature of human motivation. We really layer our desires.
We do. But establishing that we want things for their own sakes creates an immediate problem.
Because human beings are complicated. What happens when two ultimate goals collide?
How do we decide which one wins?
Right? Edwards realized he could not just define an ultimate end. He had to build a hierarchy.
That moves our conversation from the types of ends to the actual hierarchy of ends.
So, Edwards introduces another pair of terms here.
We have established what an ultimate end is. It is something sought for its own sake.
But Edwards says that two goals can both be ultimate and yet not be equal.
One can be the chief end and the other an inferior end.
The chief end is the one most valued and most sought after by the agent.
To illustrate this, Edwards uses a striking example from the 18th century.
Imagine a man traveling to obtain two different benefits.
First, he is traveling to obtain the possession and enjoyment of a bride who is very dear to him.
Second, he is traveling to look through a newly invented optic glass, a telescope, to gratify his curiosity.
Now, he desires both of these things for their own sakes.
He does not want the bride just to get the telescope.
And he does not want the telescope just to get the bride.
Right. They are both ultimate ends. But one is vastly superior to the other.
Obtaining his beloved bride is his chief end.
Looking through the telescope is his inferior end.
They are both final goals, but they carry completely different weights.
And this is where Edwards introduces a fascinating logical wrinkle.
He asks a question that pushes against our basic assumptions.
He asks, can a stepping stone, a subordinate end, be valued more highly than an actual final ultimate end?
The instinct is to say no. The final goal should always be the most valuable.
But Edwards says yes, it happened all the time.
He uses the sum of money example to prove it.
Imagine a man traveling to accomplish two things.
First, he wants to visit some friends.
Second, he wants to receive a massive sum of money.
The money is a subordinate end. He only wants it for the pleasure and honor it will buy him later.
Seeing his friends is an ultimate end. He wants to see them for the sake of the visit itself.
However, obtaining the massive sum of money might be far more valued by the man than the pleasure of seeing his friends.
The stepping stone to honor is valued far higher than the final goal of a friendly visit. Wait, let me stop you there because my brain is snagging on this.
Sure, let us unpack it.
If the visit with friends is an ultimate end, and the money is just a subordinate end, how can the money be valued more?
It is a great question.
Does not the final payoff always have to be higher? I am trying to map this onto everyday life, and it feels counterintuitive.
That is precisely what I thought when I first read it. It feels backwards.
Yeah, completely backwards.
But Edwards points out that we are comparing two completely different tracks of desire.
Okay, two separate tracks.
Right. The man has one track of desire pointing toward his friends.
And he has another separate track of desire pointing toward honor and comfort.
Yes, and the money is simply a step on that second track.
Because the final goal of that second track, the honor and comfort, is so massive, the stepping stone leading to it carries immense value.
It carries more value than the entirety of the first track.
Our motivations are not flat.
Not at all. We have massive, towering subordinate goals that cast shadows over our smaller, ultimate goals.
Ah, I see. So it is about the destination the stepping stone is pointing toward. That makes perfect sense.
But Edwards establishes a strict rule here to keep the logic intact.
A subordinate end is never valued more than the specific ultimate end it points toward.
You can value the money more than the visit with your friends.
But you cannot value the money more than the honor and pleasure the money is supposed to buy.
Probably be absurd.
It would mean you value the means more than the end it is meant to achieve, which contradicts the very definition of a means.
So the rule is firm. A subordinate end is never valued more than its own specific ultimate end.
But that raises another question. Are the means and the end ever valued equally?
Is a stepping stone ever given the identical weight as the final goal?
Edwards addresses this directly, and he says yes, but it is a very rare exception.
This rare exception is crucial for setting up his later arguments about God.
Edwards explains that an ultimate end is always superior to its subordinate end, unless the ultimate end depends entirely on one single, uncompounded means.
To explain this, he tells a highly specific, somewhat quirky historical anecdote.
He asks you to imagine a pregnant woman who has a strong craving, a peculiar appetite for a certain rare fruit.
This specific fruit can only be found in the garden of a particular friend who lives far away.
So she goes on a trip to her friend's house to obtain that fruit.
The ultimate end is gratifying her strong appetite.
The subordinate end is obtaining the fruit.
Edwards argues that if she believes her appetite can be gratified by no other means than obtaining that specific fruit, and that it will certainly be gratified if she gets it, then she will value the fruit identically as much as she values the gratification of her appetite.
Let me push back on this because I want to see if we can break Edwards' logic here.
Go for it.
If the fruit is simply a physical object, a stepping stone to the chemical sensation of gratification in her brain, how can she value the object identically to the sensation?
It is a fair point to raise.
What if she arrives at the garden and the friend offers her a different fruit that is just as sweet?
Or what if she just wants an excuse to take a trip, and the fruit is a convenient reason to leave the house?
Those are the exact objections Edwards anticipates.
He puts incredibly specific boundaries around this thought experiment.
If she just wants a vacation, then the fruit is no longer the sole means to her end.
The travel itself is part of the end.
Right, and if she accepts a different sweet fruit, then her desire was not for that specific rare fruit, but for sweetness in general.
Meaning there are multiple means to her end.
Edwards argues that if, and only if, that specific rare fruit is the singular, absolute only way to satisfy the craving, the means and the end carry the identical weight in her mind.
So it is an all-or-nothing scenario.
Yes, and Edwards adds further conditions to seal the logic.
If she's doubtful whether the fruit will actually satisfy her craving, she will not value the fruit equally with the gratification.
Or if her appetite requires that rare fruit, but also requires other ingredients to be mixed with it to create a specific dish, then her value for her final goal is divided among all those several ingredients.
No single ingredient will be valued equally with the final gratification.
The math only works if it is one perfect singular means leading to one perfect singular end.
If you are listening to this and thinking, well, this feels like a massive logic puzzle, you are right.
Edwards is essentially doing mathematical proofs with human desire.
But why does he spend so much time on this bizarre example?
What is the actual point he is trying to make for us?
He is proving a point about human limitation.
He explains that it rarely happens that a subordinate end is equally valued with its final end.
Because obtaining a final goal rarely depends on one single infallible stepping stone.
Human desires are messy. We need multiple ingredients, multiple conditions.
And we are often doubtful if our plans will even work.
Because our means are fractured, uncertain, and prone to failure, our final goals remain supreme in our minds.
Therefore, human final goals are commonly our highest goals.
He is meticulously establishing the supremacy of final goals.
This is all a massive setup for how we must view a perfect being's goals.
If a perfect being has a single supreme goal and uses perfect, infallible means to achieve it, how does that framework operate?
We have mapped out the intricate mechanics of human motivation, but humans are fragile.
Now, we shift the focus to the creator of the universe, who is not fragile at all.
This is where we get into the theological heavy lifting.
We are moving from human psychology to the mind of God.
Edwards outlines a massive distinction here, the difference between original ends and consequential ends.
This is the turning point in understanding God's actions.
An original end is something valued on its own account, completely independent of all conditions or any supposition of particular circumstances.
It is a desire that exists in a vacuum.
A consequential end is something valued for its own sake, but only after certain circumstances have come into existence.
To make this clear, Edwards gives us the family man analogy.
The family man analogy is brilliant.
Edwards says, to imagine a man who natively loves society.
An inclination for fellowship is planted in his very nature.
This love for society is antecedent, meaning it comes before any particular circumstances exist.
This original love for society causes him to seek a family.
The comfort of society is his original final goal.
But once he actually has a family, new desires emerge.
He now desires peace, good order, and mutual justice within his household.
He delights in those things for their own sake. They are final goals in the daily management of his house.
But they were not his original end. He did not seek a family just so he could enforce rules.
The justice and peace of the family became a goal consequentially.
They depend entirely on the family existing in the first place.
Let us apply this directly to God, relying on our shared Reformed theology framework.
We adhere to the Westminster Confession, which teaches that God is completely self-sufficient.
This is the doctrine of aseity. He lacks nothing.
He's not lonely. He does not need a cheering section.
So before creation, before a single star or atom existed, what was God's original goal?
What inclination moved him to create the universe?
After creation, we know God desires justice. He desires to fulfill his promises to his creatures.
The scriptures are full of this.
But Edwards is pointing out that those desires are consequential.
God's love of doing justly to intelligent beings was not what originally induced him to create the world.
That completely shifts how we view God's justice.
The justice of God's nature makes a just regulation agreeable, but there must be subjects to regulate first.
Think about the philosophical nightmare that occurs if we get this wrong.
If God created the universe because he needed someone to be just toward, then God is dependent on us to actualize his own character.
He would be incomplete without a universe to manage.
Edwards annihilates that idea.
As Edwards argues, the perfection we call God's faithfulness, his inclination to fulfill his promises, could not properly be what moved him to create the world.
You cannot fulfill a promise to a creature that does not exist.
The faithfulness of God is a consequential goal.
Once the world is created and God has bound himself by promise to his creatures, then his faithfulness moves him in his providential actions towards them.
Exercising his faithfulness is a final goal in a lower sense because God delights in truth for its own sake.
But it was not the original ultimate end of creation.
This protects God's self-sufficiency perfectly.
God did not create the universe because he was a lonely judge who lacked a courtroom to enforce his rulings.
His justice and faithfulness are consequential goals. They are reactions to the existence of the universe.
There must be an original independent goal that caused him to create everything to begin with.
An original ultimate end.
Edwards states that this original ultimate end of creation is the only thing that induces God to give the occasion for consequential ends.
It is the root cause of everything.
And this brings us to a massive structural point in Edwards' logic.
He states that the more original the end is, the more extensive and universal it is.
That which God had primarily in view in creating the world must be constantly kept in view.
It must have a governing influence in all of God's works.
It governs everything he does towards his creatures.
We have two sorts of final goals, original and consequential.
When we speak of God's final goal in the creation of the world, we are talking about that highest original independent sense.
The reason that existed before time began.
If God has an original independent reason for creating the universe, does that reason still matter for you today?
Edwards connects the original act of creation to the ongoing timeline of history.
He says that the original goal of creation is the most extensive and universal goal, governing all of God's subsequent works in providence.
Providence, in our Reformed understanding, is how God sustains, directs, and governs all creatures and actions.
So I have a question to pose to you.
Sure, what is it?
Does this mean that the overarching use God makes of the world right now is identical to the reason he designed it in the first place?
It does. Edwards uses airtight logic here.
He states that whatever appears to be God's final goal in his works of providence in general, that must be the final goal of the work of creation itself.
God's works of providence in general are the identical thing as the general use to which he puts the world he has made.
You can look at the general trajectory as how the universe operates to deduce the reason it was made.
You can argue from the general use God makes of the world backward to the general end for which he designed it.
He is not operating on two different blueprints.
The blueprint of creation and the blueprint of daily providence are identical.
Let us expand on that, because it is easy to look at the world and see isolated events that do not seem to fit a grand, singular blueprint.
Edwards admits that God might have certain goals, in particular emergent circumstances that are not the original goal of creation.
In isolated instances, God acts to fulfill a consequential goal, like delivering a specific judgment or fulfilling a specific promise to a specific person.
But if we are looking at the use of the world in general, the vast sweep of history and reality, the final goal does not depend on particular cases.
It depends on the nature of things in general and God's general design in the constitution of the universe.
This completely affirms the Westminster Confession's view of a sovereign God.
God is not reacting to unforeseen circumstances.
He is not making things up as he goes along, adjusting his final goals because human beings surprised him with their choices.
There is one supreme original goal.
Edwards will argue in the rest of his dissertation that this original goal is God's own glory.
For our purposes in this introduction, the vital takeaway is the structure itself.
Every single act of providence, every event in history, every physical law of nature is either a subordinate stepping stone or a consequential action moving toward that singular, supreme, original goal.
That brings incredible weight to everyday life.
Edwards concludes his introduction by saying that if there is but one thing that is originally agreeable to God, independent of any future supposed cases, then there can be but one last end of God's work in this highest sense.
One supreme peak that everything else points toward.
We have covered a massive amount of ground today on Reformed thinking.
We started with a basic question about the anatomy of a decision, looking at the difference between the bitter medicine we tolerate and the sweet fruit we crave.
We moved through the complicated hierarchy of human desires, where towering subordinate goals can overshadow our smaller ultimate goals.
We wrestled with the rare exception of the single, perfect means, which proved just how fractured and fragile human planning truly is.
And that fragility set up the perfect contrast for understanding the God of the Westminster Confession.
A God who is entirely self-sufficient, lacking nothing, who did not create the universe out of loneliness or need.
We saw how God's justice and faithfulness, while glorious, are consequential reactions to the existence of his creatures.
They are the rules of the house, but they are not the reason the house was built.
The reason the house was built, the original independent motive for creation, is the singular force that governs every single act of providence in history.
The blueprint of creation and the blueprint of providence are one and the same.
Which leaves us with a closing consideration for you to mull over this week.
We have spent this deep dive analyzing the mechanics of goals, ends, and stepping stones.
We have looked at how a perfect God governs the cosmos with absolute precision, aiming all of history toward one supreme, original goal.
Think about your own life this week.
Think about the traffic jams, the tedious spreadsheets, the unexpected delays, and the moments of intense frustration.
If God's original reason for creating the universe is the identical reason governing his daily providence today, how does that shift your perspective on those random, seemingly disconnected events you experience?
In a universe governed by the God of the Westminster Confession, operating under the precise logic Edwards has outlined, there are no wasted stepping stones.
Every single subordinate end in your life is being governed by a creator who is moving all things toward a supreme ultimate end.
If there is a chief end governing the cosmos, nothing is random.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive on Reformed thinking. We will see you next time.